is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness. Interviews with some of the best academics in the ivory tower and dropping it right into your earbud so you can think, reflect, wrestle with the biggest questions of life and challenges of faith. And today on the podcast, it's Jacob Allen Cook. He's a postdoctoral fellow at Wake Forest University School of Divinity and author of the brand new book, Worldview Theory, Whiteness, and the Future of Evangelical Faith. Oh, it's a good one. Yeah. Now, this is a totally fun conversation. Jacob and I have a bunch of mutual friends. One of whom's been let's see, David Gushee. He studied with Gushee and all the peeps at McAfee. We've done a number of live podcasts at McAfee School of Theology in Atlanta. Anyway, we also are friends with Ryan Newsom. So he's been on the podcast recently discussing his book on monuments and race in America. And Jacob is here to talk about worldview theory. Oh, yeah. Now, some of you are going to be familiar when you hear the word. It might be a bit triggering. Don't worry. We're trying to dig into the history, its use, and what gets itself done in it. And if you're unfamiliar with the word worldview when you hear it, it's because you probably weren't part of the evangelical intellectual industrial complex in the 20th century, but it has shaped a lot of what goes on today. So looking forward to hearing your response to this conversation, because we had some fun. And we had some detours and all sorts of other things that are related to this, and laughed quite a bit. And I decided not to cut out all of the detours and the laughing and the going back and forth, because it just flowed better. Sounded more fun. And and I want you also to know, like, if you go to the link, the podcast page, like where this audio is currently hosted, you'll find links to the book. It is a big academic book, a bit expensive, but he also has a series of articles that he's been publishing that are tying the larger research of this project into kind of the public conversation today around anti-racism, worldview, and how it functions in evangelicalism, and the challenges the church is facing and such. So those are all linked there. You should go check them out. But now, before we jump into this, I just want to remind everyone, Lent is on the way. Lent, that season that moves for the 40 days up to Holy Week. Right, so we're preparing for Holy Week, and in that season of Lent, I'm being joined by my friend Diana Butler-Bass, friend of the podcast. She and I are going to be hosting a class called Jesus Deconstructed. That's right, you can go to JesusDeconstructed.com, and in this class, guess what? We're going to talk about Jesus. Oh, talk about one cool figure who also brings a large amount of baggage when he comes up. So what do you do? How do you wrestle with Jesus if you're trying to set aside some baggage that he brings? Well, we both wrote books on Jesus. We're going to talk about those books, talk about them with each other and all the questions that you will bring. So go to JesusDeconstructed.com. You can sign up. It goes through the whole Lenten season. There are 6 main sessions. There are 2 kind of special Q&As that are specifically about stuff that comes out of our books. The content and shape of the class is getting shaped by the responses that members give to the first 2 big questions. Oh, yeah. But I'm not telling you what they are. No. I am going to let you find out when you go to JesusDeconstructed.com. Once you sign up, you'll get an email. It will include info on the 2 questions that are going to shape the content of the class. We really want to know. So JesusDeconstructed.com. It's a donation-based class, which means you can give absolutely nothing, and you still get to participate. So join us this Lent, JesusDeconstructed.com. Me, Diana Butler-Bass, and shush, we might have some friends and surprises coming. Alrighty. Here we go, Jacob Allen Cook. It's fun. Peace. All right. right. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. On the podcast today, Jacob Allen Cook, author of Worldview Theory, Whiteness in the Future of Evangelical Faith. And if you are saying worldview and evangelicals, is this the first time Tripp's going to have someone on with hot witnessing tips? You're right. I'm so excited to have an evangelist against worldviews right here, Jacob. So before I jump in to talk about this book, we have a lot of mutual friends, and you are currently postdoc at Wake Forest University School of Divinity in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is the place 4 members in my family have degrees. Me, my wife, my brother, and my brother-in-law, all Wake Forest School of Divinity grads. Go Deeks. It was an amazing football season. You get access to Bojangles on a regular basis. You can get fresh beer at Foothills, coffee from Cranky's. What a wonderful, wonderful place to be in. Anyway, this book, while it does explore the questions around worldview, the future of evangelicalism, it engages it through an interdisciplinary way. A lot of people's first contact with using the phrase worldview, and that is going to be an evangelical context. It's not like you walk around your first day in a humanities degree and they're like, now here's an essential part. Have you thought about doing the atheist, materialist, reductionist worldview class? Because it's really essential if you want to succeed in the academy. So maybe you could begin by talking about when you first met the concept of worldview and your kind of autobiography in relationship to it. That led you to spend enough time to write a giant book.
Well, that actually is probably a conversation worth having. Some of it would need to happen off the record, naming names and all that. I'll save that.
Well, it's just between you and me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, at least for right now. So the truth is, I didn't grow up in the church, but when I came into the church, it was in a variety of evangelical contexts. And so I picked up some of this stuff, but not really from the mainstream elites, you might say, right? That was not the perspective I was getting. It was just sort of the, everyday rank and file perspective, right? Biblicism and all that. But then by the time I made my way to Fuller Theological Seminary, where I did my doctoral work, that's when I really started hearing this particular term as having a kind of weight, a kind of comprehensiveness that I did not understand it had before. So I started bumping up against perspectives, and this was sort of the language that was used in defense. And then I started running into problems because I didn't share some of the more detailed perspectives that seemed to be necessary to hold the biblical worldview. So that was a piece of this. And then the truth is, when I started digging into this, trying to understand, well, what is this thing that I'm bumping up against? I read Molly Worthen's book, Apostles of Reason, and she really points up the notion of worldview as a big piece of what's going on in evangelicals defining themselves over the last 70, 75 years, something like that. So that's sort of how I came into the language itself.
And when what is the point of adopting worldview theory? What is the anxiety or fear you think that it's answering a question? Because if you step back and then look at the history of evangelicalism and start to track its frequency of use, as modernity progresses, it becomes more and more a dominant kind of master signifier, at least within Protestantism, to think about its distinctiveness of its kind of culture and often its superiority and what's entailed in it. But do you think that there's particular features, as you were looking through the sociology, psychology, culture and stuff, that made that an attractive concept for framing religious identity?
Absolutely. I think that in any given moment, when we look back at the history of how this has gone on, the concept of worldview, seemed to be something that other people were doing first. And so we from our side, right, the Christian folk were supposedly playing catch up over against folks who were better organized and more comprehensively developed than we were. And so I think that that's a big piece of it, right? It's for Abraham Kuyper back in the early, 20th century, what he's talking about is modernism, and the kind of secularism that's going on in the culture around him, and the slide and all that stuff, right? And over against this modernizing worldview that he sees epitomized in the French Revolution, what's going on down there in godless France, right? That's what he's trying to defend against. So he says, in order to promote the kind of culture that we've come to love here, we need to have an equally comprehensive perspective that we throw back in their faces, right? The same language is used by Harold Ockenga in the World War II era in the United States. At horror and aghast at what's going on in Europe, right? With Nazism, fascism, communism on the march, right? And the fear when you look around with a fundamentalist perspective of modernism here in the United States, Ockenga says, we've got to develop a full-orbed perspective that is going to help us resist, help us even push back and make gains against these perspectives that are pushing from without. So it's a impulse, an instinct that arises almost within folks to push back.
So do you think that one way of describing it is something like as culture, in a sense, diversifies, and part of the diversity is expanding connection to more cultures in general across Europe via technologies of communication, interaction, different cultures in the world wars, all that kind of stuff, and inheriting the growing religious diversity post-Reformation in Europe and through migration in the United States. Like, once you start bumping up against more and more difference, then part of those other kind of socio-cultural constellations feel like a threat to your own identity, be it
absolutely
like secular French scientism, or Catholics immigrating into a certain part of America that was Protestant dominant before, or all these different things. Yes. One of our desires, right, into forming our identity, which isn't inherently unhealthy, right, is to recognize what makes you distinctive and cherish your identity. And there are some really beautiful things at the heart of Protestant faith and even the evangelical expression of it. But something like sours or becomes poisonous when you start to look at the big history of how preserving identity in evangelicalism cultivated this the function of worldview, and that sets up a framework for interaction that I think in the book you lay out in ways that problematize it. Is that a helpful? Is that an accurate summary of what you were getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are deep philosophical problems that we could get down into, but fundamentally, the biggest piece of what's going on and what I'm most concerned about when I look at how folks use the language and concept of worldview in the world is about posture, how we position ourselves towards others. And that is, so I've been doing this series on Baptist News Global, unpacking the thesis or the hypothesis of the book in various ways. And most recently, I was talking about a perspective that James Baldwin offers in his essay, Nothing Personal, where he describes how really we don't do well, particularly as Americans, but human beings in general. We don't do well at revealing ourselves. We don't really want to do that. We're insecure deep down often. And so we build these labyrinthine walls around ourselves to protect us. What happens, though, is when we project this attitude towards the world, we end up interpreting everybody through it, looking back at ourselves in self-reflection. We see only those walls. We never really get down to the deep down stuff. And so a big piece of what's going on is this protection, but we end up not seeing others or ourselves or God clearly because of this kind of filtering effect.
And I like the contrast you use between, there's a posture is not the perspective, and oftentimes people confuse it, right? So your perspective, your deep values from your perspective as at any location, like as an evangelical Christian in the South, or growing up there in that context, in that space, you can have a perspective, and that's different than that perspective taking a kind of animosity in its posture towards the neighbor, towards the other, towards your enemy, right? And I think it's obvious that that's problematic in the sense that once you go, what is the posture Jesus asks his followers to have towards the neighbor, towards the other, towards the enemy? Maybe those in whom you have more power. Like none of it is the posture of animosity, defensiveness, and supremacy. But that's just not what Jesus suggests. He's like, blessed are those.
Anywhere. No.
Blessed are those who hijack school boards and then impose your prejudice on unwilling children. So, but underneath, right, like even the joke about school boards, right, like we see that playing out now that when a group feels like the others have a posture of judgment towards them, then like it comes back. And so often the tendency in American evangelicalism has been to always see itself as the least powerful figure, the one that is being the victim and, marginalized. And then the rest of American culture is like, you're telling me that white Protestantism is being persecuted? What?
That's right.
Like,
don't you see it? Isn't it clear?
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
Yes, that is. But I mean, that's the thing, right? So this kind of thinking gives language to, it gives you a way of expressing this sense of victimhood, and at the same time gives you sort of motivation, gives you conceptuality for getting out there and changing the situation as you see fit. I will say that I think that more often than not, thinking about the like Jesus posture in the world and all of that, I think more often than not, folks who are taking up this perspective don't start there. So like Abraham Kuyper, for instance, like when he's talking about this language, he describes what it means to be made in God's image as fundamentally boiling down to the worldview thing, right? Like we were made to be worldviewers. That's what it means to be made in God's image. God is big. God made the whole world and that is God revealing what's going on in the mind of God. And so humans, as the microcosm of God's mind within the universe, our job is to reflect back to God a complete picture of that universe, right? And Jesus, when Jesus comes along, all he's trying to do is restore the original creation, right? We're living out of a lost past as opposed to a future that's trying to break into the present. So, like perspective theologically, right? It starts off in a fundamentally different place than I would think is probably most helpful based on our experience in the world.
Okay, so you name drop Abraham Kuyper. Now, if you are, deeply invested in Reform world, then that like Abraham Kuyper is the equivalent of someone walking around Claremont and saying John Cobb or Whitehead, right? Like, of course, we all know who Kuyper. But for those that aren't a part of or have been a part of the kind of Reformed church conversation, I think it would be real helpful to dig in, which is the first third of the book, right? It's like exploring Kuyper. Say a bit about who he is, his life, and kind of deal with some of those themes in his work and how they showed up. Because as you mentioned earlier, he still has such a strong shaping power in the life of evangelicalism, even the more edgy versions, say like that you encountered when you're at Fuller. So kind of assume we don't know much, but how is Kuyper and his account of worldview something that's real helpful to understand kind of the neo-reformed identity in this century?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic, in some ways, right, this is maybe I shouldn't say this, but I hope that there are plenty of people who are like, yes, please tell me who Abraham Kuyper is. I don't know him. So, because in the world that I'm coming out of Fuller, like that just is so much of the conversation that's going on there, and folks assume his rightness. So, Abraham Kuyper is a figure at the turn of the century, 125 years ago, who, in his context, he's a very powerful fellow, right? Like, not only is he a theologian, but, he starts newspapers and founds political parties and ends up serving, as prime minister for a while, and helps found the Free University, right? Like, he has all of these things that in his own context make him a powerful figure. At one point, though, he's involved invited over to give the Stone lectures, Levi P. Stone lectures at Princeton Theological Seminary. And that's where he develops in a more lay accessible way what's going on in his understanding of worldview, several key elements of it, and how this competes then on the world scene in terms that are really reflective of, in a way that maybe he hadn't said quite the same way before, of sort of a Hegelian view of the world, right? Especially the kind of culture battles and what's going on in different civilizations around the world, and how this is really comparative in his mind, assuming some sort of uniformity on the inside. So that's how he enters the American imagination, right, is by way of these lectures. And then, Princeton Theological Seminary early on is a hub for this kind of like neo-fundamentalist come evangelical movement. And so he makes his impact by way of this sort of thinking and influencing those folks in that orbit. So that's what's going on there, and why he as a figure becomes important. Now, his thinking is something else. We could talk about that too, but.
Oh no, I think it would be important to kind of expound it, because he does play that bigger role. And I did my PhD at Claremont, so I hung out with Fuller people a lot, and everything I heard about Kuyper, I've done something, and this is a confession. I officially am going to spend my whole life never reading him.
So this is really for you. It's like, yeah, you don't know what he says, so let me tell you what he says.
Yeah, but I heard secondhand more than I ever wanted to while living in Los Angeles with and then I just did a little Googling once, and I was like, I found out just enough to then know that if you strategically bring up his kind of friendliness with apartheid South Africa, it just makes them all cringe. And that's what I always bring up. And I'm like, you know what I would do if I were a contemporary theologian? Not name drop apartheid friendly ones all the time. That's what I would do. Yeah. I like to name drop John Cobb, first person to write eco-philosophy, recognize an essential part of being part of the life-giving dream of God is addressing the ecological crisis. That's what I would do. Maybe, I don't know, the first white male theologian that insists to go back through a new versions of his text and take out sexist language. Like you could pick that one, or
that's an option.
Or, and I was being obnoxious, but I do think he plays a really important role. And like, when I decided, like, I'm just never going to read this, it was because his authority functioned as a justification within a particular community. And I'm like, huh? Like, why are we Kuyper this, Kuyper that? And our mutual friend, Ryan, was at Fuller towards the end of my time in Los Angeles. And I remember bringing it up, and he's like, oh yeah, they do that. And
yes,
and so
that's right.
The if you think of how he functions culturally, and then having spent time digging in his work, are there any, like, what are the particular ideas that the legacy of them have shaped his social function in the present?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think what we see with Kuyper is people who love him really love some of his key principles, his basic framework for how we engage, how we think about politics and engaging in the world and that kind of thing. And so what you see is a great example within this tradition of appreciating principles and not paying attention to like particularity in human beings. So they're going to really love his approach to sphere sovereignty, for instance. This is like a big piece of what's going on there, which says every kind of social circle that you can imagine, from politics to family life, education, all these things, right? What he's saying is each of these has a purpose in the world that's God-given, that when God created the universe, there was also a moral component to that universe that operates, or that would have, apart from the fall, operated just as certainly with the same kind of surety of rules, right? And each of these orbits has its own kind of rules and virtues and that kind of thing, right? People love that. They flock to that. They love the way that he talks about common grace, right? The possibility that there is an aspect of God's grace that even the heathen can appreciate. Sometimes they surprise us in their virtues, those folk who don't know God. That kind of stuff, right? Like they find a gentle perspective, but what they have to do to get there is cut out a whole lot of this particular stuff that includes, a defense of colonialism. And, he was Dutch and South Africa and all that, right? So, he's trying to defend colonialism as part of what it means to fill the earth and subdue it in Genesis, right? Like he says, we have to keep doing this because God told us to fill the world. And same kind of thing and this is where it starts to get interesting, right? So in Kuyper's perspective, he's looking back at creation, ideals, all this stuff, right? And then he makes this jump into doing his work in a kind of natural theological mode, where he's reading off the face of broken creation what some of these things look like. And so he's going to look at, for instance, what he imagines to be the static essential that is race, right? And the features that come that divide different races of human beings, and assume that those are permanent, durable features rather than accidental, and not essential to who any given human being is, right? So again, that's a piece of his perspective that's there in the principles themselves that make the whole thing problematic. They make the whole thing suspect. But instead, his contemporary disciples just say, no, that's just contextual, right? We can cut that stuff out and not have the problems. They don't carry over or taint the whole thing.
Yeah. And do you think part of it is, there's always this task, like every generation in any group, but definitely in a religious tradition, is having to parse how you inherit the tradition and the identity, right? And so, like, every time we teach a theology class, you're like,
yes,
here you're gonna get to meet Augustine and Anselm, right, and Abelard,
yes.
and you have these conversations, and parts
every time
of it,
you teach a theology class, that's who comes up.
They always come up. Anyone with an A name attached to an atonement theory, they have to be in there. You didn't know this?
Abraham Kuyper.
No, it has to be the last name.
Okay, got it.
But everyone has to do this negotiation of how you relate to your past, and so and you could easily hear someone go, "Yeah, but look, Jacob, obviously there are things that we aren't wanting to preserve, but like the sphere of sovereignty, there are tons of spheres. You're going to admit there are different spheres. And then what is it like for that sphere to be, for God's sovereignty, God's desire to reign in it? Are you against that? And common grace. Look, okay, yeah, maybe he thought it wasn't as common as I do. I'm trying to extend it a little bit, but still it's like I am trying to bring the beautiful parts into the present. And we have to do that with everything. Have you ever met a Lutheran? They have to do it a lot. And so I think one of the things I loved about the book is it's not so much a judgment that we have to be discerning. It's that the kind of discernment that we have when it's framed by worldview is one that doesn't actually problematize and cultivate the kind of suspicion we should in light of the questions we're wrestling with today. Say, the question of racism and American religious life, or the inheritance of colonialism and imperialism, things like that. Because of how we've filtered it, we filtered it through a filter that was pressed in Rome, and not
that's right
in Galilee. So is that? Help explore that, because I don't want our Reformed friends to be like, look at this Tripp he doesn't even read Abraham Kuyper. He just bragged about it, and now he got Jacob on there who's just shitting on it. Look at what.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the problem is, right, all these folks. I have friends, right, who hold these perspectives. It's not to say that you can't appreciate sphere sovereignty and get somewhere good from it or something like that, right? What I'm talking about is fundamentally the posture of worldviewing and the problems, the excesses that come into play when this is your fundamental way of approaching the world are what they pass unquestioned, right? I have not seen a good Kuyperian response to how do we protect against this thing happening the next time, right? Because what worldviewing does is it drives us to narrate the whole world and every damn thing in it according to a comprehensive perspective, as if we understood the very reason, the logos that holds it all together perfectly. Our minds restored and sanctified imaginations, right? So that we can see everything clearly. And the problem is that invites us to project a fair amount of grisly stuff into that view that we're going to assume that our inheritors then will excise, right? And that's probably not, we probably shouldn't be like telling future us, well, we'll worry about that later, right? So that we can do some good work now. Instead, it'd be better to develop a perspective that helps us actually criticize, like what is it that's driving us to see the world this way? What are the fundamental problems if we inhabit this posture? I mean, I think one of the more interesting things that I discovered, right, is like the coincidence in time of kind of a worldviewing stance in colonialism, right? This is a way of imagining, seeing, ordering the whole world and all of its peoples at the abstract level, assuming that you're not really, you can name even your own place in the world accurately, right? And then order your own life. So, I mean, I think that posture, that even in itself is important to address.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times worldview theory, like how it gets appropriated, is akin to like Spaving talking about worlding, right? Where like the British imperialist, and this is obviously in the context of India, shows up, and it's obviously a he. He's like, I need to get some native Indians to go around and make a high quality map of India, get all the native knowledge, right? And then once you get a nice map, you then make it and then hand it back out to everyone in the land you just took and go like, this is where you live. This is where you go. This is what you call it. And now you like this world has been put on the map. Now we know what's really real. And this is the terms of our engagement is the map, and it was made. Thank you for your knowledge, right? Like that act of worlding is the absorption of all the contours of a place that is your other into something that now you're inscribing and possessing and setting the table for engagement, right? Like
that's right. We are Borg.
Yeah, and I think that I think that connection's so helpful because there is an ongoing, like there's a growing awareness in Western Christianity that what we used to think was missions was intimately tied to kind of Western expansion. That at the heart of it is a growth of an economic machine that is, eating people in the planet and connected to a desire for power that the church too often has been chaplain to, right? And
that's right.
And so it's that like when worldview functions as terms for worlding any other's lived reality, then it is an act of violence because it's inscribing everything that they possess onto terms where you're the author of it.
Yes.
And you see that, right? Like I just thinking of like really bad youth retreats, where they're like, you're going to college, you got to watch out. You're going to be indoctrinated into the secular worldview, right? And then you get uncomfortable. And I've had this experience where like a student comes up to me real worried about it. And, they're, look, now I know you're not religious, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, dude, I'm a Baptist minister, and it was,
but we're not religious. We know what that word means too.
Yeah. I'm just like, look, I just remember that the consequences of it is it leads to combative suspicion
that's
towards your neighbor and defensiveness towards everything you bring, the good and the complicated and the corrupt.
That's right. And so the idea is like it kind of hardens this perspective. And like, so one language that I've started to use to describe what's going on is if this perspective becomes hardened in your mind, right? So you go to an evangelical college, right? That's the opposite of what you're going to get. So all of, evangelical schools in general, you'll find buildings that have like worldview on the side of them, Christian worldview. Like the idea is this is where you study the thing that we're talking about here, right? In the positive sense, we're filling out the Christian worldview. But when you harden your perspective, right, then you objectify other people according to that perspective. You're trying to constantly fit them into your abstract principles rather than really being able to let them speak for themselves, being able to listen in good faith to how they describe their own most important things about the world, the way that they see it, the way that they inhabit it. And so, really what I'm trying to do as I move through the book is to like tear this down. That's why we need to deconstruct the framework itself, not because the ideas within it are all wrong, but because the framework causes us to interact with people in the wrong way, in a way that's inhuman, not creaturely. So the idea is if we can tear all this down, then we can actually open up space where we can relate to other people without fear, knowing that we're held in the world by a God who's bigger than us, but wants to relate to us, always existing in that relationship. So it's like, you can start to see how the posture is different. So when you encounter another person, you're not worried that they're like smarter than you and going to colonize your mind. You can have some confidence that I woke up today and I know who I am. That's good. We need that. Psychologically, we got to know who we are to get out of bed in the morning.
And so do you want to say a bit more about how it reshapes selfhood, how it reframes what it means to be a self? And like what parts of that are you wanting to draw attention and question?
Yeah. So, Kuyper does a great job bringing this up for us because, right, he is existing in the time when psychology is starting to differentiate itself in a major way from philosophy. But his own psychology is completely philosophical. He's projecting an idealized perspective of what's going on in the human mind based on his theology. So he assumes, right, that somebody who's been reborn, the regenerate person, is going to have a reunified psychological basis for engaging the world. And then, with that sanctification, they can see everything more or less clearly. Well, I don't know any human beings that are actually like that. That's part of the problem, right? So like when you look from a perspective that's been a little more scientific in its approach to understanding what's going on in the human mind, you can understand developmentally how what he's doing makes absolute sense, right? Narrative identity theory that's been pioneered by Dan McAdams gives us a great view as to why people, especially as they move into legacy making, project a unified picture of who they are. They don't really question who they are. That's an important feature of maturity. But it's not the end point, right? Developmentally, we know that adults can continue to develop beyond just being socialized as good members of their community. But beyond that, right, for folks who study cognitive science, who are asking questions about, well, is our thinking space, is our gray matter unified in all of its stuff? Is there a structural unity to the way that we think about the world? There isn't. We are fundamentally complex folks, right? And we could talk about the embodiment layer of that, right? Which is sort of where I started on this. When I'm strained, when I'm hangry, I interact with the world differently, but it's also true socially. The way that when I'm reading the room and thinking about who's in it, I change the way that I talk. It doesn't mean that I change necessarily all the thoughts that I think, but it changes what stories come up. The history that we have changes and shapes the message that I deliver. But even when I think about like a moral issue sitting here in my office, right? There are many different sources of knowledge in my mind, right? I have history with certain people and groups, mentors that have influenced me, books I've read that don't necessarily all come to a unified perspective. And so I have to sort and sift, and I'm not always certain what is the source of the thing that I'm thinking exactly right now. So that's the knowledge piece. And sometimes we flatten our understanding of knowledge, right? All of my knowledge fits together comprehensively. And then we just assume that our psychology is just about our thoughts, rather than saying that it's even more complex than what I've just been talking about, right? Mm-hmm. The feeling center and all that comes with that. So, for instance, I think about also, we might think of W.E.B. Du Bois and his concept of double consciousness. This gets at the race piece, right? He's talking about from a non-norming perspective, from somebody who comes out of a marginalized community and yet is able to gain a hearing in a massive way because he's brilliant. And, he ends up setting sociology off as its own field, a scientific field, apart from just people philosophizing about it from their perspectives, right? But when he talks about double consciousness, he's describing how within himself, a kind of second way of looking at the world emerges, right? A second, you might say, a worldview that competes, right? And what Hegel would call an unhappy consciousness arises within him, where he can't consolidate these two perspectives. He thought he was a part of the norming community until someone told him he wasn't because of what he looked like, right? And so there's this second piece of himself that rises up within. And for many folks, this gets at the whiteness piece, right? For many folks who look like you and I, they never have an experience where their consciousness is doubled. We can often, if we don't pursue it, feel like, I'm just thinking the normal thoughts, right? This is just common sense. Everybody thinks like this. And when somebody doesn't think like that, you're like, what's wrong with you? Shouldn't you just have the common sense perspective about this? And so I think that for me gets at like the experiential root of what I'm trying to call to mind, right? For many, we don't have to think about that stuff.
Yeah. That's really helpful, because I think like at that point, I mean, like you're getting at it as to how the kind of the arrival of worldview inertia, when it shows up in American evangelical context, picks up. Yes, there are the problematic parts, right? Like in a European context, coming out of the Dutch Reformed tradition, all that kind of stuff. But it does its own kind of retwisting when it meets American religion. Yes. So could you kind of like give the historical framing, like the biography of Worldview and American Christianity, like what was going on there when you spent the time to go through it, that you're like, no, here's the thread that's important to trace to see how it actually inhibits us as followers of Christ of being faithful today. How is worldview, in a sense in America, a hindrance often to discipleship?
Yeah. Oh man. So the unique feature that America adds as a context for this kind of thing going on is the individualism that we just assume, right? So when we think about expressions of church, even our churches have never really known a kind of unified perspective. We're not even really seeking a kind of unification of the whole thing, right? We're just like, it's great if just our denomination can stay together, right? Or if a couple of us can get together from different denominations and have a good conversation. So evangelicalism, when look back at the 1940s, when this term is really being used, worldview, for the first time by neo-evangelicals trying to muster up the troops, the faithful out there, this is actually where the language of the unvoiced multitudes or the silent majority comes from. Ockenga uses this. Harold Ockenga, when he's founding the National Association of Evangelicals, he's looking out there and assuming they're there. And saying there's so many individuals out there who feel like lone wolves, but are really a part of this silent majority. And so if we could reach that audience that I imagine is out there of individuals and get them to see things clearly, we can find a sort of unity that'll help us change our social scene, right? And so that's the origin point of what's going on there. And what we see cashing out over time is that, folks who imagine themselves as caring about God, caring about the Bible, can latch on to this language pretty naturally, right? The concept of worldview. Yeah, well, I'm just seeing things in a biblical way. That's more or less how I see the world. I see it like the Bible sees it. That's the defining characteristic of my consciousness. And if you can do that as an individual human being out there on your own, then it's really, really hard to imagine why you would ever submit that authority to any group, right? And so you then like fast forward to today and you see stats coming out, like what came out here in the last couple of weeks about, I think Ryan Burge was the one who released the data on like how many folks identify white evangelicals don't go to church.
Oh yeah.
Right. So you can have the identity without even like participating in a community element at all. The idea is really, it's just about you holding the perspective in the world.
Yeah.
That's all that matters. Right?
Oh, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
I was literally writing to come back to this on a Post-it while you were saying that. And I'm interviewing Ryan in a few weeks, so I'll get to talk to him about it. But that you mentioned, just for people that may not know, like what he, and this is he's going through the data, right? Like in American religion, that there's been a growth in the number of people who identify as evangelical, of white Americans that identify as evangelicals. There's actually people that go to churches that are not white, have not switched churches and just stopped calling themselves evangelicals if you're not white. So there's that feature. But the number of white Americans who identify as evangelicals have gone up. The likelihood that they go to church regularly is less likely than good old liberal mainline Protestants. That's crazy, right? Yeah. Like, and here's the question that I think you could take and then work back through part 3 of your book. Because you mentioned there, like, it emerges, right? The National Association of Evangelicals gives the language of the silent majority. And underneath it, right? Like, when does it emerge? It emerges in religion first, and then it gets turned into a political movement by Reagan and such, right? And underneath it is going like, hey, the world around you is changing, white people. Culture change is a threat to your identity. And you might be thinking, I don't want these people that having power that look different next to me. I don't want my kids going to school with people, like all that kind of stuff. But what if it's not really that you're just uncomfortable with difference and change? What if it's that Jesus is under threat and that everything that's good about your religion and Christian identity, and obviously America, because they're basically kids and cousins, is under threat? Then it makes sense why you get a kind of like, Christian nationalism light growing, right? Like, how do you display, I vote for Donald Trump, which makes no sense if you grew up evangelical in my context and knew what they thought about Bill Clinton. It makes no sense if you are sitting there going, like, what are you saying? Like, we can't actually get a true believer. But if what evangelical means is a pious justification for your resentment and resistance to cultural change because it represents a threat to who you are, then how do you baptize it? You make it religious and you make it patriotic. And in that way, what are you protecting? What is under threat? It's not engagement with the divine. It's the preservation of the Christian worldview, which is kind of like a Trojan horse for supremacy culture. I mean, is that like... Anyway, I sadly finished your book last night, so it's like I was reading it and then was talking to you, and now you're here, and I'm just telling you what I thought about your book. The more I like the book, the worse the interview, but the more fun I have. Sorry. Does
that mean it's about to fall apart?
No. It means it just means my questions are me telling you things I read in your book, and I wonder if it relates in the way I think it did.
Yes. Yeah, I think you got it. I think I think it's going to be all right. I think you could see it coming, like one of the interesting things is for people looking back now and asking what were the original evangelicals calling themselves that about in the 1940s, right? The folks on the inside tend to say that it was really about reforming the evangelical mind. But when you look at the stated commitments, the hope was that, I think honestly, Harold Ockenga thought that it'd be easier to get a bunch of fundamentalists to agree on politics than it would be on theology, right? I mean, splintering over how we argue about what is the minute detail here on scripture or whatever, right? That we could argue about all day, but we're going to agree on like the basics of politics, right? Like we all agree that FDR was the worst thing to ever happen to America.
Yeah.
Right?
We may not know when the rapture is, but we know the Antichrist is Russian.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Ockenga, like he says that, okay, like the image, right, is there's a river that flows, right? And one bank is Christianity and the other bank is democracy and the river is capitalism. Like, imagine that you think like, how is, first of all, why is capitalism the river, right? Like, why isn't the faith the river at very least, right? But in any case, so like this is the kind of stuff that's going on back in the 40s. It's like, it's disingenuous to say that wasn't part of what we're seeing now isn't in some way a manifestation of what they were hoping for in those days, right? Like what they wanted was for evangelicalism to arrive as a social force, an identifiable contributor to this social scene. Maybe they wouldn't have liked what it became associated or yoked with. But I think you can imagine something like maybe the Bush years, right? As, yeah, we've arrived. The pollsters even are saying like evangelicals were part of who swept Bush into power, Bush too. So, I mean, I think that historically that's that piece.
How did the whole kind of evangelical identity and its kind of focus on worldview, obviously leads you to generate institutions that reinforce and create worldview, and then those institutions form the individuals, like you talked about earlier. How did those same institutions in the forming of the individuals become accelerants or kind of like fertilizer for the problematic parts of power around like race, class, gender, colonialism, and things like that? How does it end up doing that? Because in many ways, right, like if you take out an individual out of these systems, how they act and relate can have internal consistency, and they could be nice people and neighbors and such. But the institution and the things they're connected to collectively lead to preservation of ugly things and context for it to thrive.
Yeah. I mean, I think that all boils down to what is the institution itself about? How is it forming people to imagine themselves in the world? It comes down to the posture issue for me, right? And so I think that even individuals who may be nice and conversant and all of that may still be fundamentally in the way that they think about what's happening. They think about the other person, having serious problems with who you are, how you think, concern that you're going to hell, all that stuff, right? And so the idea that, well, we own the official perspective, we own God's revelation, we have it, here it is. I can write out, like, it's in the book, sure, but also read my book that tells you how to not interpret that book. It's just the natural, here is the common sense reading of this book on every point under the sun. I've got Grudem's Politics on my shelf, right? So
that's dangerous.
I think that's it. What's that?
That's dangerous.
Yeah, I know, right?
I don't want to get judged if someone sees it on my shelf.
Yeah, you gotta know what people are thinking, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it's there. It's not like I teach out of it. But this basic posture then keeps you always skeptical. Always gives you a reason not to learn or not to criticize your perspective. And so that's one aspect of it. I mean, the danger around the particular categories of identity that you have named, right? Race, gender, sexuality, whatever it is, right? Is that for those who inhabit the kind of norm, you never really have to question what is wrapped up in that norm. And if you believe it to be a part of the official worldview, the biblical worldview, God's perspective, then even when you're in conversation with other people, you can always just say, if you have to say something hard, right? Well, it's not me. I'm just talking about the Bible and what the Bible says.
Oh yeah, it's not
right?
personal.
Yeah, it's nothing personal. That's exactly right. I love you.
I mean, the one that made you and loves you completely also thinks you're a filthy sinner and needs to repent. But I'm just telling you.
Exactly. Yes. And that's like, so, when I get into the third move of the book, that's why I think it's like, it can be so freeing if you can kind of abandon your sense that you have to be the one who defends this whole thing, right? If you aren't constantly on the defense and having to inhabit this all-knowing posture in the world, which gets exhausting, and as secure as we feel in it, right? When we lay awake in bed at night, we still wonder, right? Like, is this all the right stuff? Should I be inhabiting the world in this way? If you can strip all of that away and ask the questions, for instance, Jesus shows up as a person, and the question that you ask is not, how is this possible? Bonhoeffer tells us, right? It's, who are you? And if that's not your question, if your question isn't, who are you, but how is it possible that you exist in this space like this? we're asking the wrong question, right? So it's this it's a shift from saying what matters most about who and how we are in the world is our epistemology and what we know, to saying, really, we pre-exist as relational. This is our fundamental reality, right? Is that we are creatures in relationships. And whatever we know, the best stuff that we know comes out of those relationships.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that part of that's connected to how worldview shapes, right, discipleship, like in what you're talking about, right? So if the worldview is what makes you secure and everything that entails, epistemologically, the defense of truth, knowing the truth, and its truthfulness is connected to its certainty and its finality and its closure, yes. Right? Like then whatever parts of what you hold to be true that are of God are being preserved and defended, but also whatever parts aren't are being preserved and defended in the same way.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
And when you're defending it, so often, at least in my experience, talking to people, and honestly, like thinking about in my own past, like when I had to get over the fact that having a really high IQ, reading a lot and figuring all the answers out, I eventually wasn't going to arrive and go, check this out.
Wait, I thought you had arrived.
No. I'm saving that for the 2000th episode of the podcast. I'm only like 1350 right now. So
okay.
Yeah, I got 80% there.
Okay.
Anyway, I have my growing edges. I'm not doing the full Hegelian arrival of absolute spirit until the last episode. So I don't want.
So 2000's it.
Yeah, I know.
Okay,
I know.
Okay,
it might be a long wait between. Or there might be a lot of 1,999.
Yeah, there's like decimal points now.
But like even just thinking back to it personally, like I remember realizing, like after I read Liberation Theologians for the first time, the way my situatedness in my context, I had filled in the gaps and all sorts of gospel stories, put it in my context. And then all of a sudden, Jesus was an ally at defending my world rather than the one that came to overturn it. And it wasn't until I was sitting there going, well, actually, the first time was in undergrad when I read when I did a social gospel seminar and read Clarence Jordan, and like the whole Cotton Patch Gospels, and all of a sudden I realized, whoa, I'm like much more akin to the objects of Jesus' desire, and it occasioned defensiveness.
Yes.
But what in some ways, like what I had to learn was that I was defending myself and I wasn't defending the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And that their security as a person of faith isn't because you know all that needs to be known and are there to preserve it. It's that you're known by God, that you are the beloved and you don't need to contribute. I mean, this is like the most Protestant thing ever. Right? Like the most true thing about you is you are God's beloved. And there, now.
Thanks be to God.
Like, do you have, what worldview comes out of that is not one that generates animosity and the kind of posture you're talking about. But it is just scary, right? When you realize that's what you've been doing and run up against it. And I wonder, as someone who not just has personally done it, right, like in your own story, but are trying to present and get us to wrestle with this in your text, but in like all the articles you've been doing online and such, which I'll link to on the podcast page. What are the defense mechanisms that you keep seeing coming up? And do you have any wisdom for us if we notice them in ourselves or in someone that we have open conversations with? Obviously not Twitter, but
that is the best place to have really detail-oriented conversations where people bare their souls.
Okay, good.
That, right? Yeah, that website is the place that it happens.
Well, it's where all the beauty these days originates.
That's right. In direct contact with the creators, Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, for instance, just the idea that, so my book, when it came out, it hit Twitter before I did. And thank you, David Gushee, for making that happen. And Kristen Dumais, right, tweeted about it. And, there were people that just like the basic notion, right, that the posture of biblical worldviewing had some connection with whiteness was enough to like send people spiraling, right? And, what I'm after in the book is a really genuine, careful, introspective account, right? I want people to actually wrestle with this in the privacy of their own prayer closet, right? Rather than like feeling like we have to battle this out in public all the time. So one of the things that came up in one of the many tirades against even the idea itself was concern that that somehow if we don't have a worldview perspective and this kind of certainty, the epistemological certainty, that the very values that we cherish, like human dignity and human rights and stuff that MLK fought for and all of this, right, that we don't have a basis for them. We can't argue for those things because how do we even know they're true and all of that, right? It drudges up all the old arguments against quote unquote postmodernism and what that's been inflated to mean in the minds of so many evangelicals out there. The truth is, if you can inhabit the world in a way that's like you're genuinely caring about your neighbor as a human being, and you're in good faith getting in conversations with folks, you find a lot more reasons to defend those concepts and to share those concepts than just, I believe they're somehow biblical. We just do it, right? I mean, that's part of how we're wired. We're wired as social creatures, and we look for commonality. But that's only true to the degree that we can like let down our guard a little bit and feel like we're sharing a convening table together and actually talking about it. Right. So I think that's one of the many mechanisms that I've seen pop up is like, no, we can't possibly question this because we need certainty about these concepts. But that also gets at what you described earlier. I mean, you mentioned how it's hard to think of worldviewing and not think coercive posture in the world, right? I need to build the world out. Now that I know how it should be shaped, I need to be actively shaping it to fit this perspective, right? And we feel all this responsibility to get out there and do it. And the truth is, we only have so much sway. We can only do so much. We stress ourselves out a lot and vent a lot of energy towards being frustrated about all the big stuff. And yet we carry that into our relationships and fight with our family about it at the dinner table. And, it basically worldviewing ruins our lives in much the same way that like it's hard to watch a football game with somebody from the opposite team, right? Like it would have been fun, but you had to get a little too intense there, right? Went a little too far.
Yeah. But I think you point out something important, right? When problematizing the history and the consequences of kind of the centering worldview as a means for kind of cultural engagement by white evangelicals, if the response is, well, without this and everything that's entailed in it, then where is purpose, meaning, and value come from? To me, when I hear that, I usually just feel sorry, right? Like that, and not that as a philosopher of religion, I do think too few people think about where meaning, purpose, and value come from. It's just that this is the mechanism for their defense and preservation. Certain prestige comes by being a worldview defender in a community that's defined by the worldview.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's different than someone who is a philosopher helping you ask meaning, purpose, value questions, because when philosophers are good at it, then their own community kind of has its complicated relationship with them. Yeah. And as evidence, just like to point to Socrates, Buddha, Jesus, like all three of them, were fruits of a tradition. And precisely because they took the questions of meaning, purpose, value, these big questions, beauty, goodness, truth, seriously, they didn't become the defenders of the truth regime. They became the problematizers of its legitimation. And it's a different stance or posture towards truth. But that posture shouldn't be a threat to it. It's on behalf of that you raise those kind of questions and critical engagements.
I think of when it comes to like freedom and how we relate to each other and what all of this means, I find the prepositions helpful, right? So like our relationship to each other can be with, for, and over against. And each of those are very important, right? So me being over against you sometimes is also being with and for you, right? And I think that that's like these gadflies that you're naming in their traditions that are, stinging folks and trying to wake them up to what's going on in their own perspective, are trying to say, it's not necessarily that all the things you know are wrong, but how you hold that truth and the way that you defend yourself with it suggests that you've missed the heart of the whole thing. And so that makes me sad. And I want to help you live differently. Not necessarily abandon everything that you think you know, but to live differently, to feel differently about it, to relate to God. Directly, right? Don't feel like God is only going to look upon you and hear your prayers if you're holding the right worldview, right? Like, that's not how this works. Our relationship with God is unmediated by that worldview. I think that's part of the beauty for me in the way that Bonhoeffer describes that moment of confrontation between the living Jesus and the human logos operating within our minds, right? He says Jesus shows up and problematizes that by being a person and not an idea. And so if Jesus lives to problematize our thoughts, our reasoning minds that really, really want the worldview to be secure, even if it's got God and Jesus in it, right? The question that's posed to us is kill or be killed. Mm-hmm. And, it's hard to choose be killed. I would much rather have the certainty, right? Certainty about the killing, about why Jesus died and had to die, and how that helps support all this worldviewing that I'm doing, as opposed to letting Jesus do the slaying when he needs the nonviolent slaying of my heart, so that he might raise me again to new life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's really helpful. When you wrote this, this is connected to your research for your dissertation? Is that?
Sure. Yeah.
So, did you actually write part 3 about your current seminary president while you were a student there?
Yes. Well, okay. So truth is, he was seminary president when I came in.
Okay.
But by the time I was dissertating, Dr. Laberton had taken over. Yeah.
Okay. But so maybe say something about, I would love for you, looking back at this, like to say something, one, about Richard Mouw just as a figure in this, but and maybe Fuller Theological Seminary more broadly about this debate around worldview because of its location in Los Angeles and everything. It so often has been forced to wrestle with questions the rest of the American worldview industrial complex wrestles with 15 years later. What do you think Richard Mouw's inheritance of that in a context that's asking questions kind of before the rest of the evangelical culture does? How did that situation kind of open up your own reflection on the concept, but also how it's playing out historically?
Yeah, I mean, Mao's an interesting figure. In all of this, he's an inheritor of both the Dutch Reformed tradition and the evangelical tradition. So like he kind of brings those two worlds together. He cut his teeth not out on the West Coast, though. So like he's hired to do that job as someone who's already seen as kind of defending this perspective. He comes into a position of influence partly by rising against what was at the time the establishment, the evangelical establishment, right? Fighting for a seat at the table when, folks who are maybe a little more progressive on some social issues were written out. Obviously, he looked like the other folks, but he was not particularly excited in a good way about the Vietnam War and wanted to, march with the civil rights folks who were involved in that and like saw the problems of economic exploitation in our late capitalist culture and all that stuff, right? So like he has, especially as a young man, is involved with these younger evangelicals, Ron Sider and Jim Wallace and all those. Like you look at the scene now and you think, well, yeah, they grew apart, didn't they? Like all these folks. But that's kind of like how he emerges on the scene. And And then he's seen as somebody who can have this kind of conversation about what it means to be an evangelical in a way that's civil, right? I mean, that's the language that's often associated with his particular iteration of this whole thing, right? Is that he's the champion of civility, which in my estimation, right, often boils down to I can treat you nicely even as I advocate for trampling on your rights. You know, particularly in the book, I get down to the issue of same-sex marriage, right? And he even says about that particular issue, it's hard for me to be civil about sex, which I don't quite understand why as a person, right? Like he's lived a fine life and married a long time and has a kid and all that stuff, right? Like his own sex life isn't endangered by someone else having a different kind of sex life from him.
Yeah.
It's like, why can't you be civil about someone else's life? Well, I mean, really, it boils down to the heart of neo-Calvinist thought is this sphere sovereignty perspective. You look back at original creation and ask, what basis is there for this? And the best you got is God made them male and female, and they got together, right? And that's marriage.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing hinges on that, and what you can imagine emerges from it. Mm-hmm. That's a pretty fragile place to place all your to find all your security, your intellectual security, right?
Well, and I think that the sexuality question, especially while he was at Fuller, it spread through evangelicalism as a growing question. He also had a complicated relationship with like Rob Bell, who's probably one of the more famous graduates of Fuller Theological Seminary, for Love Wins, followed by like being open and affirming publicly. Though I think like there's no like he evolved like Barack Obama evolved, on the issue. So, but I say this because here's something that strikes me, and I don't know if it's just because I put too many things I thought on the internet before I thought about it, so I'd never had the option of taking it back. But I have talked to tons of people. This isn't just explicitly at Fuller Seminary professors. This is just people in religious contexts where they are performing things publicly on behalf of the mission of the school or the faith statement they signed that's connected to the mission of the school, and it's all being supported. It's all connected to this. We teach the Christian worldview, right? But then, if we had like a off the record vote of tenured faculty that have PhDs in the Bible at Fuller Seminary, or just all the people they taught for their PhDs in the Bible, you're not getting half of them to be like, yeah, I'm against LGBTQ inclusion. You're just not. Like, and I know it because I've talked to plenty of them, and even one of them that I've talked to about it explicitly that is against it is like, yeah, but I'm pretty sure most of my peers agree with you. So, like, help me understand that, because I get angry about it. Mm-hmm. I mock them in the Road Deadman, the movie I made. So, like, I'm not saying this like this is like a new thing for Tripp to get upset, but does that perspective of how the worldview thing functions give a different kind of understanding for why certain people in leadership perform their roles in totality, and then either like it's not till they leave that they get honest on all this other stuff because there's some kind of like seizing of their imagination, or I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's like you could really imagine that a job description would include among its duties, right? Like inhabit this known perspective and perform it in public, right? I mean, it doesn't exactly say that, but if you have to sign on to the statement of faith and the community standards as things that you more or less, I mean, I can't remember what the exact language is now, but I think you have to not only say that you won't teach against them, but there was a season when you had to say that you agreed with them. And so, the idea is, how do you, that's a fundamentally different thing, right? It's one thing to say like, okay, I understand this. I can operate by this as a grammar. And then I can also use that language to say why I don't agree with XYZ thing, right? That maybe
the dominant perspective. So it's like, yeah, we all agree to do our work with reference to this, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to like always come down on the same points, right? In exactly the same ways. And I think that just the culture that was shaped there was such that is to some degree still, although I think some of that's waning a little bit, just hyper defensive of this perspective. I think people maybe are a little more excited about it even when they get there, and then over time, that when they start to realize what it feels like and what's really going on there and how shaky the epistemological ground is, they're like, maybe not, And I think honestly, the more time passes and the more human experiences you have, and the more people ask you these hard questions that are about their own experience, their existence in the world, it humanizes them and it humanizes you, and people change, Yeah. So it's tough.
Well, and I mean, like, even thinking of, right, like that predicament, I've had friends who were faculty at Fuller not get tenured over it, and ones I know that agree with them that they do like weird workarounds to keep them around because they just aren't going to ask them a question. And then think of like the way that same context played out when you have the student group forming around allies, and whether we're going to have to make sure all the gay students are celibate and like that kind of stuff. And then when issues of race and stuff came up there, right? Like the same kind of legacies.
I was there for all of that, by the way.
I guess it would be important to say, it's like, you went there. It is my last name, Fuller. But also, like, I've told people they have asked about it to go there. So this isn't like Fuller's like an example of a place because of the Mao chapter and things, and both of us having connection to it. That's why I was giving the examples. But and it does foreshadow, I think, very often in evangelical history, what the next fights are going to be at Christianity Today, and then at their local churches as the culture more shaped by urban context, spreads out. But did you see a connection, or how was the question of sex and race different when it was playing out in that kind of melding of the like Dutch Reformed and evangelical context, when as Fuller kind of was shaped by it through Mao?
Yeah. Well, I think that the conversations played out fundamentally differently, for one thing. You could imagine that, especially for someone like Mao, who had already in his own mind made progress from where other early evangelicals, like 40s evangelicals and 50s, had been on race, he was very interested in inclusion. But one of the troubles is, right, when you imagine inclusion as inviting more people to the table that's already set, the folks that you get may look different, but they don't sound much different. So you're managing the diversity. You're selecting for folks who are more like you. The same has not been true in terms of sexuality, right? Because sexuality is seen as perspectival, right? Like, it's part of the perspective. And so it's like, we can't get somebody to the table who's an evangelical and has different beliefs about sexuality, because they don't exist. So the best you can get is like somebody who identifies as sexually other but remains celibate because of their commitment to the evangelical perspective. So like, you might be able to get someone like that over here, side B folks or something, right? But so the conversations played out very differently. But interestingly, right, the stuff about race that actually started to come to the surface. So the year was 2018. And I was graduating from Fuller Theological Seminary, and at the baccalaureate services, right, there was a protest, an actual protest that it was somewhat staged, and that I think that folks knew it was going to happen. Some of it was going to happen. The administration, they had some heads up. But what they were protesting was the toxic whiteness of the institution. Well, we had a Center for Black Church Studies and Center for Asian American Church Studies and a Centro Latino, right? Like, we had centers for diversity perspectives, right? In our imagination, but they were centers. It's like, yeah, we had those perspectives too, but like the evangelical one at the center of the institution hadn't changed much. it hadn't borne the influence of these other perspectives. And so what they were protesting was, have we really changed the way that we inhabit theology, the way that theology is done? Or is it just, yeah, we can allow some more contextual perspectives from within the same camp to show up? So when the sexuality conversation comes up, it feels fundamentally different in some ways because it's not received on the side of those who are so dead set against any such inclusion as the same kind of conversation. We're not interested in diversity on this particular issue.
And for those that are interested in that particular conversation, I would definitely check out the interview I did with Willie Jennings on his book After Whiteness. It spends a lot of time looking at how that shows up in the education institution and theological education in particular, because it is a real challenge, right? Like, well, just even think of it as a theologian. When you teach theology and then you're like, well, I'm going to do a week on liberation theology. Then I'll do a week on black theology, right? And that kind of thing. That is that kind of inclusion into the whole we already set. Like, do you want to come to our dinner? And here's the menu. Tell us what you want. We have options.
That's right. That's right.
And
you're vegetarian? Like, oh, we can do that.
Yeah, but like in one sense, it's like, yeah, you can pick anything off the stuff we make, but please don't ask me to change my spice cabinet and what vegetables are in season and that kind of thing. Okay, so there are a few other topics that were like tangentially related to it that are things that have happened since you wrote it that I wanted to ask about. One is how, having done this kind of research, when the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill's podcast goes off, the looking back at the young, restless, and reformed tradition and things. Like, how did you read that? Like, were there particular parts of the kind of more recent retrospective in that story that you're like, yeah, here are the things that weren't getting brought up and aren't being examined, and it would be real important for us to think about this if we're wanting to learn more, and not kind of like give the problem so we can curse the problem to then stay the same.
That's right. I mean, I think what you learn from something like that, and there's so many conversations out there about failed particular examples, human beings who had like exercised failed leadership and the imagination that goes into supporting them over time and all of that stuff, right? I think that the main thing that what I've been reflecting on since, and I've been putting this in some of the articles in various ways, right, is this question of how do you, within evangelicalism as we understand it, how do you get platformed? How do you receive standing? And the truth is, like, there's not a great screen for the bad characters, right? It's like, you don't know they're bad until they do something bad. You could really like what they're saying, what they're selling. And the way that they get platformed is you buy it, right? You show up, you keep showing up, you buy their stuff, you like them on Twitter, you do all that, right? And numbers seem to be the name of the game, like as if that is the main thing that counts for whether or not you're morally right in the world. So the idea that this is really what it's about becomes reinscribed or reinforced by figures who are able to, seize our imaginations and make use of those categories without ever having to question them. So I think that's a fundamental, again, it comes back to the posture, right? It's about how we inhabit the world, what we think the experts are doing when they're doing it.
And do you think that the kind of toxicity that shows up in the kind of American white reformed situation, like, what do you make of that? Because I feel like, it's not like that's the only context this kind of thing shows up in, but it does, at least it would be easy to think that it selects for it with a kind of tenacity that maybe other parts of the church don't, right? Like if you wanted to be a United Methodist minister, you'd have to get a psych eval. And anyway, so do you think, like, how does the way identity construction has functioned in that context permit more of
select for.
Yeah. Select for. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the old business term is your system is perfectly designed for the results you're getting. Right. So if you don't like the results, change the system. And particularly when we're talking about individual folks who gain standing in front of audiences that they imagine that are just full of individuals casting their judgments. It's really easy for the charismatic individual, the demagogue at the church level, right, to come in and capture the attitudes of the many. They capture their attention, help direct and drive them, speak to their needs and their fears, give them a source of security, right? Certainty, help them understand how they're supposed to engage in the world. And all of that engenders and requires, so it depends on and it engenders confidence and a willingness to engage the world through this lens, through this screen, right? And you won't survive as a leader in that world if you don't have it, right? And if you can't capture the attention of the many and all of that. So I think absolutely it selects for it. And theologically, right, we know that many of the folks who hold this perspective are at very least coming out of a tradition that has a very deeply inscribed sense of patriarchy. And that's what, we see the Twitter battles unfold around folks like Kristen Dumais and Beth Barr and others, right, calling attention to the cultural genesis of so many of these problematic perspectives that are then read into Scripture as if they're in the Bible from the start. I think that many of these folks who emerge as leaders in this movement are wrestling with that inheritance. And so some of the characteristics, even if they tend to a more egalitarian perspective, right, it again comes to the folks who lead are the folks with charisma and are willing to throw their weight around and all of that, male or female, right now. So Rosaria Butterfield can wade into the scene and still cause trouble, right? Whatever it is. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like it, if you have the right perspective on the world, it pushes you to then try to make everybody converts and make everybody fit and all that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that all the energy that's invested in the life of kind of American evangelicalism, white evangelicalism around worldview, leads to a different kind of experience for those that, are, in scare quotes, deconstructing, or people that are ex-evangelicals. And for those that maybe, didn't have that experience, it's hard to imagine sometimes the violent outbursts that come in the process. I was having a conversation with someone that was in a much more conservative context than me, who was just really animated and worked up and all this and I'm like, look, you were just in you were in a cul-de-sac of Christianity, and all the things you're complaining about, just most of those things, they're not normative for everything in Christianity. It was your cul-de-sac. You should just move neighborhoods. And and he got really upset, and he said, Tripp, you have no idea. You just want me to move to a new neighborhood? How do I know I'm going to get to be there forever? You don't have answers to all these questions. It starts going into and essentially going I want the blanket of worldview. Give me that. Do you even count as a Christian if you don't believe, insert all the worldview things? I'm literally, I read the Bible and pray every day. I my entire life is trying to tell people you can use your brain and be a committed follower of Jesus at the same time. I serve the Eucharist. I baptize people. I will literally pray.
It's not efficacious, though.
I was I literally pray with you right now. And you can ask Jesus back in your heart. Let's not go are you a real Christian? I'm not saying I'm good at it all the time, but in whatever way you get to choose your own identity. I picked that one. I'm not an exclusivist in any way. I'm just saying because but you don't even really believe the Bible. I'm what the hell, and I was getting irritated. And I thought back to that conversation from a few months ago, reading your book, and wondered, as someone that spent a lot of time digging in, how does that change the way for those of us that weren't in that space to see kind of the violence, pain, and anger that shows up in that process of deconstructing or becoming, ex-evangelical and things?
Yeah, it feels like the whole world. That's the point, right? It's worldview is a portmanteau. It's worldview. It's a view of the whole world, right? And you're made to feel when you're inside that machine, like, you can be ecumenical in some ways, reach out to the folks who agree with you on certain social issues, right? We've all seen the Manhattan Declaration, and Catholics and Orthodox and some Protestant folks agree on, or evangelical folks agree on, whatever. We should be against abortion and hate gay people and whatever. So like, that's one way of understanding what's going on is you get so wrapped up in thinking that the way that you see it is the whole thing. Like you're seeing the whole world, you see it the best. And then the most important thing, right? Because you've been nurtured in this culture is, well, how do I maintain my standing in this group of folks who share this perspective with me? Right? That becomes the battle. And so it becomes really painful. You're wrapped up in it. And if you're trying to exit from it, or like ask, or not even if you're trying to exit, if you're just trying to ask serious questions on the inside and like start to get pushed towards the exit, that's where it comes from, right? And so I think for many, when they start to like see what's going on, it feels like, if you've seen The Good Place, right? It's that realization moment. This is the bad place, right? Like I'm actually existing within this small neighborhood that was designed just for me to receive maximum suffering while not even realizing I'm suffering. Like how long can we keep this going on?
That's a great example. Oh, it's the other one that popped into mind is like Loki, like the Loki show. Is a giant story about deconstruction, right? Like he knows his identity. Then he's told like, oh, we prune out anything that's not in this. And there's actually a whole system that's doing it because why? We have to preserve the one precious timeline. Yes. This is great. Like, aren't you amazed at this? And now you're going to help us and you're going to help us prune the timeline. Right. And then you're like, no, they're the bad guys. And then like, what do you do with it at that space? Like, do you really want to open up to the chaos? It's the end of the world, the multiverse of madness. Like that whole,
that's
like,
right, exactly.
Like he's, little did know that, that Loki is, he's a recent grad, currently deconstructing, leaving Fuller Seminary at the end of Loki season 1. And he doesn't know what to do about the weird, the sexual tension he has with the bi girl he met that also really resonates with him. Yeah.
Themself.
Yeah, because you have to draw a distinction between that part of yourself in order to really engage it. Because if you knew it as yourself as you were relating to that otherness, it would really problematize the identity that is your cherished self-image. You have to hold in with a tight grip. It's So you're waking up in hell, or you find out that pruning was the preservation of your oppression. When you confuse jewelry with chains, it's really ugly. But
it's so easy to do, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think thinking of it that way, like I really get why. I constantly have these conversations with people who are leaving it behind. They're like, I wish I could look at Jesus like you do. I just don't even know how to do it because there's like all this baggage with it. And how do you like re-engage that conversation after the kind of trauma, pain, disappointment, and stuff that's there? I was promised this grand solution to all things, and that's not what you're talking about right now. And I don't really know, I don't really know what to do with that. But I think recognizing just how much was being removed. Right. It helps those of us that aren't in that situation have more patience and compassion, because so often to me, I'm just like, yeah, inerrancy's stupid. Colonialism was always bad. Being racist, not cool. You don't have to be obsessed with everyone's private parts. And it's fun to learn about science and philosophy and your neighbor's spiritual practices. And if you find out someone has the tarot around, you don't have to shoot them. Right. Like and you're like, I don't sweat it.
I mean, that's it though, right? I mean, like it's the whole thing. That's what's so scary about it is it feels like it's everything you are. Like we invest all of our identity in this one thing, and we become so fragile to any sort of like difference because of it. like when somebody starts to like scratch below that thing, we get defensive. We circle the wagons. We project outward an even stronger attachment to it, rather than kind of receiving it as just another human being who's like against all odds trying to make a human connection with us.
Yeah.
Like God forbid somebody just reach out and try to connect with us. But the same is true, right? Like, I think that's where theologically we can like find hope, find a new start if we can see God as alive and reaching out to us, right? Like, that's the hope. The hope is not that I've got the right, like I can pry the right worldview details off a dead guy, or off of like the book, or off of the creation that I have no access to at this point, from my place in the middle, right? The hope is that God lives. God interacts with us and is constantly trying to like draw us out of that heart curved in on itself, right? Like, I just imagine, or if you've seen Soul, right? The folks like down there who are like just doing their thing and like lost in this world, right? And they're absorbed, and it's hard to get, like, that's where we are with worldviewing, right? We're like lost and we're just like wrapped in on ourselves. And the most violence God does to us, right, is in the moment, if that is what we want to call it, right? Those moments of trying to like confront that, right? Trying to like contort God's self to like get down underneath us and look up at us and like see our face and say, "Hey, hi there, let's talk."
It isn't that the it's been a long time since I've read the Narnia series, but the dragon with all the scales, and they actually have to get removed. Mm-hmm. But it's in the removal of it, like anything that that involves renegotiating who you are and your own identity, all that stuff can be really painful. But it's not torture, right? And taking the time to remove the scales and discover that you aren't the dragon that you've grown accustomed to in the mirror is a painful act. But an enemy doesn't remove them for you, right? Like, that's it. And so like, I do think they, I don't know if I'd use the word violence, but like, that's also one of those words that's migrating currently in culture.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
Like, I really I think it's important to draw distinctions, like actual physical harm, sure. So many times people equate rhetorical violence with like physical violence, because we use the word violence to go like, you aren't taking seriously the power of words. But we can take seriously the power of words. There's also a distinction between me picking on you and stabbing you. That's absolutely an important one.
Yes.
And I don't, that's a complete aside, but I regularly don't know what to do with it. Or maybe it isn't, but
I mean, I think that, when you think about, for instance, the way that, think back to the question of, if without worldview, like, how do we confront the injustices of the day, right? And like, I think about Martin Luther King Jr. describing soul force, and you think about it in the context of actual civil disobedience that requires you confronting or putting yourself in front of somebody who positions themselves as an enemy towards you, right? And it's not like you're in opposition to them, right? Like, you're standing in a position that is opposed to them, not by your choosing. And you aren't like just shrinking from that, right? But you're also not willing to like harm them. You're not trying to like damage them into a new perspective, right? The hope is human. You're there to humanize. You're there to remove the layers of demonization to the best that you can, right? So like, I think that is, again, like, that's, if we think about the perspectives that we're talking about letting down, I don't know that it's that different. It's certainly not violence is the wrong word, but like, I guess that's what I'm getting at is, even from God, like when we imagine what God is doing, like the most coercive, the most like God inserting God's self into a situation that will happen when we think about, I think in terms of like freedom and consent in our contemporary language, right? And so it's like God gets in front of us, right? And does God's very best to look us in the eye, to show us to reveal something in a personal way of God's own heart. And that's fundamentally different from just assuming you've got to read the book and get it.
Yeah.
You know?
I just want you to know, as a process theologian, that descriptive picture of the divine insistence and call in the moment is beautiful. Endorse. So here's the other, like, tangentially related topic that I wanted to hear what you thought, because even though the language worldview doesn't get picked up in other communities, I think there's something similar that functions in it. And I actually think that part of the increasing anxiety among white evangelicals, like, part of it is like changing culture and all that kind of stuff. But the other part is, like, there is a growing animosity in the non-religious part of America, especially kind of the secular elites that have a growing influence in the Democratic Party, which then uses state power to kind of enforce cultural norms that for evangelicals feel like threats to their identity. And then the discourse that comes back to it. I wonder how similar you see it functioning. Think like the Richard Mao of secular academia is someone like Steven Pinker. Right? He's
that's right.
He doesn't talk about worldview. He just talks about reason, rationality, and he's got charts, data, and you should love the Enlightenment. And
absolutely. Yeah.
And then it presumes, like, oh, we'll trust the science, or we'll look at the data. All these things, they are acting as if they're value-free statements, and that a threat to it is actually a threat to everything good in America. And like, how would you even have democracy and chemotherapy if it wasn't for my sweeping dismissal towards all cultures that aren't part of kind of secular humanist culture, right? Like, how do you see them as similar? Because I find them equally off-putting, and if I had to pick which one I wanted to hang out with on the weekends, I don't know what I would do. It's just Steve Pinker's the only in his tribe are the only ones that hang out on the Epstein plane. So that might just be like the reason not to pick it.
I mean, is that better than drinking alone? Is the question, right? Like,
yeah, what was the Jerry Falwell Jr.'s thing about, like, his mom made his dad a fundamentalist, basically, but he couldn't drink, but he had Baptist wine, and he was taking down bottles of NyQuil.
Whole bottles of cough syrup. Golly. Oh, can you imagine?
Like, I can't believe he lived that long if that's what he was pounding.
I know, that's what I thought. I was like, that's medicine, right? Like, yes. You shouldn't do that. That's bad for your liver.
You're like, you should have refilled the NyQuil bottle with Jim Beam. Be a real Baptist.
Well, maybe that's what happened. Okay. You know, I mean, it's a wink nod situation, right? Like, we know what bottle it has to go in, but
what flavor is that NyQuil?
Yeah.
Anyway, Steven Pinker and the secular version of Worldview, like, how similar do you think they are?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so that's part of the origin, right? The Christian worldviewers thought they were opposing the Enlightenment, like, godless perspective, right? So it's like, even from the beginning of this, they thought that, right? The assumption is they're very similar, and they function in similar ways. The problem with both is the kind of like imperial hold that they have on our minds, on our worlds, on politics, on all of it, right? And so it doesn't do us any good just to, like, jump from one ship to another or something like that. I think that is absolutely what we see happening. It's like, you could imagine how you don't necessarily even have to, although in the most recent political cycles, campaign cycles, you see it at the conventions. Parties frame the differences as a battle of visions of America, right? Which is it's the same thing, different language, right? What they're saying is our team and their team don't see the world the same way. And it boils down to every damn thing, right? How we interpret every aspect of this thing, who you are, what you care about, what we're trying to do together as a project. All of that is shaped in a way that is coherent, cohesive, fits together. And we don't like their picture of the world. It's bad, whichever they it is. So the language translates, and I think also, in folks that I may be a little friendlier to theologically, I'm not 100% sure that the narrative boat misses the same problem, right? Like, You could change the language and say we're just talking about the story of God or something, and still inhabit it with the same posture, still take up the same problematic way of engaging others, right?
And I think that there is a sense that one of the consequences of evangelicals in America creating parallel institutions demanding that your identity lead to an allegiance of them is that the enemy that they thought they had has become more a reality because they left those institutions in context, right? So if you can't engage in like if all of your peeps, an overwhelming majority, move to one political party because of white resentment, I mean commitment to the biblical worldview and the worldview strategy that was developed by the Republican Party, and then you create parallel institutions so that throughout the upbringing of the child and through college and all this kind of stuff, and even like if you go to a state school, right? Like, oh, you're at InterVarsity, you're at Young Life, and this kind of thing. And if those places that you're in, even in a secular institution, cultivate an ideology of that posture that you're talking about, then it's not surprising that those that aren't a part of it relate back with the same kind of posture.
Yeah,
right. So
that's right.
take Steven Pinker, for example, that I had a friend that was really into it, and I read one of his books. He's just like wrong about the history of the Enlightenment and philosophers. Like he even calls people agnostics and atheists that were practicing Christians, or maybe they were Christian agnostics who went to church every week, and
Yeah, sure.
or like picking random features just so he could tell a story. It's like I was like, this is like reading and a church history book written by a fundamentalist explaining how everything went dark right until we rediscovered the Bible. But actually the right people that understood the Bible were on the frontier of the United States. And then we have the true church, or whatever.
Exactly.
You're like, I may find a few things to string on it, but ultimately I represent the high mark of human existence. So you're welcome. And it's not personal. It's just reason. It's just enlightenment. Are you against democracies? Do you want, and underneath it is the assumption, like even if you take Pinker as an example, is that global capitalism is a net gain to humanity and the planet. Now, I'll just say that I'm not 100% sure that's true. And
that's the most controversial thing we said all day.
I know. I'm not 100% sure that's true. And I'm going to guess if he took an up or down vote just of other tenured faculty at Harvard, it's not settled. The institution that he's saying is lionizing this, and I feel like that feels similar to me as when someone sits down and is like, Jacob, I just want you to know I've been praying about you. I mean, I know you think you're a Christian and I guess you've studied it and stuff, but you do know what's essential to being Christian, right? Mm-hmm. Insert whatever I think's wrong with you. And it's not personal. I just wanted you to know I'll be praying for you. I think you should dig in the Word. And if you have a question, I read half of this book over here that has a whole history of everything in it, and you should read it because if that is real, I'm right. How do you feel?
Exactly. Yes.
You feel affirmed? Listen to?
Exactly. I do. I absolutely. I know you really care for me, and
thank you.
You're just out for my good. And every now and then I just kind of wake up on the wrong side of the bed and my reasoner just isn't working really good, So
it happens.
I'm thankful for the jump start.
You got to hydrate early in the morning.
That's right. Yeah. Hydrate. And it can't only be with coffee.
No, from the Word.
Or booze.
From the Word. You got to drink the Word early in the morning.
That's right. Yeah.
Plant your roots by the stream. Psalm 1. Come on.
Did you, I don't know if you had the same thing occur to you, but when reading Life Together by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he talks about, letting God's voice be the first voice in your ear in the morning, like waking in silence, it's very clear that he was not thinking about a community that included children,
Well, yeah.
My day depends a lot on how much earlier I get up than my kids.
Yeah, I think he was, I think that whole not having children thing really reframes. But he does actually. I do think how he explores the concept of arcane disciplines in a religionless Christianity is like really helpful, right? Because there is Metaxas, a way of reading Bonhoeffer where he justifies, right, the worldview agenda. When in fact, I think like part of what he's pointing out in ethics and in letters and papers is the way in which if the energizing power of religion is connected to any totalitarian picture of the world, it ends in death, and it should be the death of that God. And so then you ask yourself, as an inheritor of Christendom, what does it mean to believe in God today? And that's why only the suffering God can help, only one that's been pushed out to the margins. And then, like, where do you center yourself in these arcane disciplines? But the arcane disciplines are what? They are the answer to what posture of discipleship is, right? Like that you've been raising. And that's so, like, how do you cultivate those is different than how do you internalize fear and prejudice and apologetic skills in your high schoolers before they go take their first biology class in a secular institution, or go into a voting booth and see a whole list of names in their neighbors that have D's next to their name.
Yes, that's exactly right. I'm glad that I mean, I don't even know if I talked about that in the book. It, like, so much stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. What Bonhoeffer talked about with the arcane disciplines and the idea that there are things that we can't even, I mean, this is so important, right? There are things that are so important about faith that have been handed down over the centuries that we can't put down on paper adequately. You can only learn them, human to human, person to person, God's spirit to our spirit. Like, in that mix, that's where you actually learn the most important stuff, the final stuff, the stuff that is like, really, you can learn a whole bunch of facts. You can read the Bible cover to cover multiple times, understand as much as you can all those stories and have the details in your brain, and still not like have the main thing, which is what is preserved in this kind of like space for something, the discipline of the mystery, right? We've got to hold space for the mysteriousness of a God who lives. It all boils down to that, right? And so our defensive posture, like, we're holding a loudspeaker up to the human condition, right? Rather than finding, like, even in good faith, searching out its solution in the kind of relational human, the only space that's really going to provide any kind of security. We are so much more radically contingent in this world than a worldview could ever tell us, right? We depend for our very existence upon a God who lives and holds it all together. That's weird. We can't explain the kind of creature we are. How do we have what we've got going on inside of us? It doesn't make sense. God holds it together, right? All of that contingency suggests that the most important things are mysterious. We ought to be good disciples of that. We ought to be good stewards of that, and search that out, right? In our conversations, in our relationships, in our churches, in our everything. That's the most important thing.
So when you look back at this work and then think of the present moment, are there particular questions or tasks people that are a part of the faith today, ones that are wanting to hand something less burdensome off to the next generation? Like, what are the kind of questions or things we should be wrestling with? Yeah.
That is what occupies my mind a lot these days. Because, once you've done this book took, I think I pitched the proposal in 2015, like it took me 6 years to do all of this deconstructing and questioning. And not every move in the book is deconstructive, right? Like I'd make these turns toward the constructive, and even the whole last bit of it really is an attempt to recover some of the more beautiful elements of Bonhoeffer's theology and rehabilitate them for the world that we're living in now. I feel like there are a lot of tasks in front of us, and first and foremost among them is trying to take up a practice of inhabiting the world in more human ways, to try to right-size our perspective, to try to keep before ourselves as a spiritual practice that we are but one creature in a world that only God can truly view. I think it all starts there. If God is alive, to interact with us, to lead us. If the call of Jesus comes to us presently from a Jesus who has risen from the grave, right? Then we have a task that is both certain in that we know we have it, we have a task, but we don't know what it looks like every day, right? And we don't know how to pursue it. So it all starts there, and then it branches out, right? And so like I'm imagining like even what my next project, what I envision it looking like is trying to take a slow walk through, where do we go from there? Like, how do we build out from this perspective, and what practices are involved, and how do we sort of rehabilitate even the basic, what we think of as like spiritually formative practices, so that we might create, foster, nurture a different way of being in the world, right? So how is our silence practiced differently when our silence is coupled with an attempt to really be present to a living God, right? Practicing presence. We have to quiet ourselves for that. Or what does it look like for us to practice prayer in a way that's not just praying before the audience of our God concept in our own mind, right? The risk is always that we're just praying to our idea of God and not God. So like, I just think there are numerous things like that. It also comes into how do we study in ways that open us to the many sources, right? Like, why would we ever be fearful of science as if it has something to threaten here, right? Like Bonhoeffer says, the risk in the modern world is that we continue to confine God to the gaps of our knowledge, so that science describes more and more of the world, and we give God the mysterious space at the fringes. He says, no, God's in the middle of all that, right? Like, there's no risk to this thing here. Same could be said of how we inhabit the world as creatures sustained from below by a world full of diversity, right? Diverse creatures, diverse flora and fauna, right? Like, all of these aspects have their bearing on what it means to be Christians in the world, and we have to slow down and think about that, right? So I think the task is, how do we remake our lives after without the blanket of security that comes, right? And maybe all of this honestly just comes from the fact that, like, as a kid, I had a security blanket, right? Like, my favorite blanket was my road partner. It went with me everywhere. And once when I was very young, we left it at a hotel, and I've been searching for that blankie ever since, like never again did it return to me. And so now I guess I'm just bent on taking other people's blankies from them. Like we'll get just real psychologically projective about it, right? Like that's
as long as you do it to yourself and not me, it's okay. So, okay. So one last question, it's kind of a follow up to that, but as a scholar and a person of faith that's also wrestled with this, has it helped you be more intentional about anything specific or think through parts of parenting? I mean, you mentioned you have 3 kids, I do, and I think that's one of the kind of haunting questions for a lot of us is we wouldn't understand ourselves and have been blessed in many ways by a religious tradition, and we want to hand on the blessing and not completely force our children into extra therapy because of it. So
that's right.
Having spent so much time thinking about this, has it changed or helped you reflect on offering the tradition or Christian identity and such to your kids?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic question. I think there are 2 ways that I would respond to it. The first is like just the theoretical perspective, right? We have to, from our perspective here, like we're aging, right? Like we aren't as young as we once were. We aren't kids for sure. Developmental psychology suggests it's good for kids to go through a phase, periods of certainty with their ideas, right? Like I think one thing that we could do, and this is in my own mind, is normalize a process of deconstruction to help our kids do it when it's the right time. But we have to give them stuff to deconstruct, and that doesn't mean it's funny to think, for instance, I read somewhere recently that they think that some dinosaurs, like Triceratops, for instance, when they're babies, they actually did eat meat. to get big fast, and then they would shift to vegetables, like they needed it at a developmental period. I don't know if that's true, but it's like,
but it
I don't
should
think
be
that we're
for
going
this
to be
illustration.
Yeah. What's that?
It should be for this illustration.
I mean, yeah, we're just going to assume. And the idea could be, right, like you give your kids conservative theology for a while, knowing that they need something to rebel against. And then you're there ready to help. Like, oh yeah, okay, let's have this conversation now, right? But the truth is, right, I think we need a very fluid relationship with what it is that we're trying to pass on to our kids. We have goals, and what we're trying to pass on is not necessarily the ideas themselves. That's not the main goal. The main goal is the posture. And so I think that, for one thing, is that can adapt over time depending on where they are developmentally. The other is, this bit about recognizing others as persons and engaging them genuinely, right? I think that it really does, on good days, it helps me look my kids in the eyes, see them where they are and for who they are, to hear their questions as genuine, to respond to them as a person, to want to treat them well, and see how I can't 100% understand what's going on behind those mysterious eyes, they are other to me. They represent a limit to my ability to know. And they help me. I mean, this is one of the more beautiful parts of Bonhoeffer's theology coming out of the garden, right? They help me learn to love my limit on good days, right? As does my wife, Abigail, right? Like when you look somebody in the eye and love them and want to do right by them, you aren't constantly trying to reach out and have more of who they are than they're giving. You are always wanting for more. And the mystery of who they are is part of what makes them lovable to us, right? And so it's like that with kids too. Kids can be so challenging and frustrating and all of those things, right? But they're also little mysteries running around that to be loved and to who want to reveal themselves to us under the best of circumstances. So I think that like it's both things. Like in terms of formation, there's a beauty to those relationships. But like on the theory side, I think it is important to ask those questions about how do we help them all along the developmental process come into a faith that they can own and that they can walk in with a sense of agency. That's good Baptist thinking for you to end on, right? Like,
well, that's good. Well, I mean, it's always good to end on true biblical Christianity. Really an expression of the one good, right worldview.
That's why we don't capitalize it, right? It's little b Baptist.
Yeah, little b. But but if you're in the South, it's hard not to use a big B when you say it.
That's
because
right. Well, yeah,
the long vowel Baptist, the long vowel makes the B pop. And you're like, whoa, is that a capital? Not on purpose. Not on purpose.
I think I heard a capital in there.
Yeah.
I think it was the whole thing was capital is what it was.
Yes. Yeah. As long as when you write the word Baptist, you don't spill white out over all other expressions of the faith.
Indeed. Yeah. Or just like they're anonymized and included within, like
Anonymous Baptist.
Yeah. The Anonymous Baptist. Really deep down, you're a Baptist. You like freedom, you're a Baptist.
Yeah. Well, I think the United Methodists are currently realizing just how Baptist most of their churches are. Well, that was probably triggering to them. But I've really enjoyed getting to talk about the book, Jacob.
Absolutely.
Is there anything you want to make sure people know about, to follow, check out, and such? Like, what's the easiest way to keep up as you keep, doing the articles and such? Is there a website you want to push people to, Twitter?
Yeah,
like
thanks for asking. So I spent a little time this week while we've been fire evacuated from campus setting up a website for myself. So I do have a personal website. So if you Google search my name, you'll find that. And soon, I think probably in the next month and a half, I'm going to experiment with a podcast of my own.
Ooh.
Yes, indeed. So the announcement will come there. You can follow me on Twitter too. And that's like where I'm constantly like in contact with folks. But my hope is to start teasing out some of this stuff that we were talking about here at the end, right? Like how do we talk honestly about where we can go from here? What is, now that we're at ground zero, what does inhabiting the world in a good way look like, right? How can we do this with some flexibility and experimentation and openness? So that's, I think that's where I would push people, right? Keep following, because soon there will be more goodness to be had.
Ooh, oh, that's exciting. Well, it's been a blast. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was great.